states who I actually interviewed last night in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, and in Texas. Last night, they gave us their opinions of what they thought would happen during the election and what we could expect. And now we'll see if those panned out or not. So first of all, we will go to Jason Peters. He is a freelance journalist currently on the ground in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Hello, Peter. Nice to speak to you again. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the camera around and show you a really cool moment that's about to happen. Here is a protest for Ant Smith, an activist that was arrested. It's focused on the Walter Wallace shooting. Over here is a protest. You can see a big sign that says "Every vote counts." That is the election protest, and that is the Walter Wallace protest. We're about to see a melding of the two out here in the streets of Philadelphia. They are very much two groups that are intertwined. In Philadelphia, the protest culture, they all want the same things. These are all progressives in the city that feel left behind. So if you're sympathetic to Black Lives Matter, you're likely the same type of person that would come out and talk about what's going on with the election here in Philadelphia.
People in Philadelphia protesting, not the people who are protesting the police shooting, but the people who are protesting for the vote. Is there concern that President Trump will try to shut down voting in Philadelphia or steal Pennsylvania?
Well, yes, that is the main concern. Earlier today, a few of the Trump family members, Eric, Laura, and a couple other of the guys, were over by the convention center where votes are actually being counted right now. But a group called Refuse Fascism kept them away and forced them to go to a part of the city where there would be less protesters, less people, less commotion. So the protest was successful in stopping and preventing a press conference from the president's family. But Eric Trump continues to tweet things like "We won Pennsylvania," despite the fact that 2/3 or at least half of the mail-in ballots haven't come in yet for Philadelphia. And as we know, about that number of mail-in ballots for Philadelphia and Pittsburgh would be enough to flip the state in favor of Joe Biden. Mail-in or regular? Mail-in, there was something like 325,000 mail-in ballots in Philadelphia that were in person. There's another expected 3,500. Last time I checked, about half, at like 150,000 were fully counted. But we're getting reports hour by hour, stopping usually at 9 p.m. See, the protests have just caught up to each other. This is a truck by a performing arts group. They're just pulling up. You can hear them chant "Free Ant," "Black Lives Matter." The protesting culture in this city. Yep. All that. But I want people to know it is not chaos in Philly. It is not scary. There's been no violence or anything looking towards violence. However, the military is here. But it'll be interesting to see what comes.
Later in the broadcast, but if not, we understand the fast-moving situation on the ground. All right, next. Yeah. All right, next we will talk to Lucas Mulligan, a journalist and documentary filmmaker in Arizona. Lucas, are you there? Okay, it seems we're having some trouble. Hi, Lucas. So, what can you tell us about what's happening in Arizona? I know that when we spoke last night, you talked about the very long lines that you observed at polling places in Maricopa County, the county where Phoenix, Arizona is located. And we saw that Biden took Maricopa County by a lot. That was enough to turn Arizona blue.
Yeah, so definitely, it was a really, honestly, for this state showed up for not just the presidential race, but also some of the Senate races, and some of the initiatives that passed. Arizona, this has been their second attempt at passing cannabis deregulation and legalization here in the state, and it finally passed with kind of a larger margin than was expected, at least by a lot of people. What to say, and right now, even though out a little bit about it. So hopefully there's able to prevent some, there's some safeguards in there to help people understand that everything was taking place. And even another big issue that we're seeing is people here are upset they were given Sharpies instead of actual pins to fill out their ballots. So some of them were worried that they might, make their ballots have issues being counted. But Katie Hobbs and also people from across the state have already been confirming if there's any issues with the ballots, bleeding through or anything like that, then it'll definitely be they'll definitely still be counted. So it's been interesting seeing people's reactions, but also seeing the state turn so blue at the same time.
Blue, or at least a lean Dem state, instead of a swing state or a lean red state?
I mean, if this election is any reflection of where we're going, then 100%. This was not just a vote for Biden. This was a vote for Mark Kelly and vote in the Senate, which is a very hard thing to come by nowadays for the Democratic Party. So I think we're definitely seeing a major shift, and hopefully more dialogue, because I've been working and covering politics in the state for almost 10 years, and that's been one of the biggest issues, is actually having dialogue between the Republican and the Democratic Party, whether it be on the state level or just the people that reflect our state on the national level. So we're hoping this is going to prevent some more objectivity. So,
and do you think that the success that Biden and the Dems have seen in Arizona, can that be attributed to any demographic group? Is that a sign of the power of the Latino vote, especially around Phoenix?
Oh, completely. I mean, Phoenix is definitely went a lot more blue than it has in past years, and even some of the Latinx groups we worked with here, reached out to 800,000 doors and knocked on 800,000 doors during a pandemic. During having all these issues, that's incredible. And so I don't think it was 100% them, but they had a big driving force. Also, there's large groups of people that have moved, tens of thousands of people that moved from California recently, whether it be Southern California or Central, to Arizona and other states nearby to save money on taxes and things. So I think those are also playing a big, reflection on the political shift here in the state.
Now I'll just we have this is actually taken from sorry about the latest electoral map taken from Politico, actually. And as you can see, it shows that Arizona has been called for Biden. Michigan has been called for Biden. Wisconsin has been called for Biden. We're still awaiting results in Nevada. In your experience, what is sort of the relationship between voters in Nevada and Arizona? Do they tend to be made up of the same group? So do voters in Arizona usually, or voters in Nevada usually follow voters in Arizona, or is it very different? And so, do you think it's fair to say that Nevada tends to be a bluer state than Arizona? So, if Arizona is going blue, that's a good sign that Nevada will likely go for Biden as well. All right. Well, thank you, Lucas. Now we'll talk about a state that is kind of similar, Texas. Texas also has a large Latino population. Many people thought it could go blue, though it was always a bit of a reach. BA, you're the founder of the Veritas Group. You're an expert on Texas politics. You spoke to us last night, reminding us that the Latino vote is not a monolith, that Democrats cannot take it for granted, and that while Texas would probably go blue eventually, it might not be last night. It certainly seems, based on this map, that that's the case. Can you tell us what happened?
For Texas, Democrats and Republicans alike. In 2016, Texan Democrats, they had a great night. Nationally, not so much. And it seems like this year that was flipped. I do stand by my remarks, moving forward 2022, 2024, the likelihood of it going blue is very, very possible. And it was very possible last night as well. Everything really indicated that we could potentially be on track to see Texas flip to a blue state. Again, 17 million registered voters in Texas. Early ballots look like 10 million, which is fantastic considering Texas, some people say it's not necessarily a red state, it's a non-voting state. And then we touched on Harris County and some of the issues that were going on there. I had mentioned Harris County, they were looking to achieve 1.7, 1.8 million votes. They fell short at about 1.6, a little over 1.6 million votes in Harris County, which again, third largest county in the nation. So Democrats and Republicans were really looking to see what this county did, knowing that it teeters between Republican and Democrat. 2016, it ended up being resoundingly a blue county. And looking at the 2020 results last night, the Democrats were really relying on higher margins in Harris County, especially, as you pointed out, with the Latino vote. Biden doesn't carry that the same way Clinton did. And so higher margins in a county like Harris were really, really important, especially when you look at what happened in Rio Grande Valley. I think a lot of people, including the media, yeah, sure. this sense of the Latino vote, the Latino electorate is taken for granted and just simply not understood, to be frank. There's a lot of responsibility with this. And you asked me, you prompted me yesterday about the reliability of the Latino vote. And I couldn't really say either way, because even you and I had a Twitter exchange last night after Texas was called, saying reliability comes from sincere engagement. Sincere engagement translates to knowing that a voter bloc is going to turn out for you. To this day, even when we say Latino vote is not a monolith, I'm not sure most people in the media even understand what that actually means. I mean, if I hear one more explainer on the Cuban vote, I think I'm going to scream. It's driving me insane to think that we're still being put in these blocks that aren't realistic. The Latino vote, to a lot of people, doesn't even exist. That's not a real thing, because among Latinos in this electorate, you have so many different nationalities and experiences that contribute to how they're going to turn out the vote. And if we're not talking, like the Democrats aren't talking policy, aren't individually going to the local Latino electorates and sincerely engaging with them, reliability isn't even a part of this conversation yet, but it can be. There is so much potential that was clearly left on the table last night. Yeah, well, famous last words. Beto had said, I think a couple months ago, Texas is Biden's to lose. There was a lot of resources and money that we touched on yesterday, talking about how much the DNC has poured into, mobilizing and organizing not only the presidential election turnout, but also for the down ballot and down ticket. So there was so much momentum here going into last night that for Democrats, it's really unfortunate that they missed this opportunity. And that really does put into question the next couple of years. And they need to take a sincere look, some good introspection on what they're doing wrong. Listen, pressing the button and, pressing play on Despacito at a campaign rally isn't going to get you Latino voters. We need to start talking about policy. Again, we need to start talking to Latinos as individuals and really make that sincere effort to engage with them in all the different counties, because Latinos come from all different places in this world and carry many different experiences that impacts their outlook.
He is the editorial director of the Appeal Political Report. Last night we talked to you about some of the down ballot races and the ballot initiatives that you were tracking, especially DA races. Can you tell us how those turned out? Did progressive district attorneys get elected? Did progressive ballot initiatives, succeed? And what happened in terms of the Senate and House races?
Right. All great questions.
I think you're muted, Dan.
Oh.
Sorry, let me... I may have muted you. How about now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Sorry about that.
So it's a great question, Peter, because I think all of us have been trying to balance the focus on obviously caring about who wins the presidential election and the importance.
Sorry about that. We lost you for a bit. Can you repeat that? All right.
connect what what you were just discussing. There have been some very important elections when it comes to ICE and the powers that ICE enjoys at the level of law enforcement locally, because ICE really depends on the cooperation in many places of jails, of police departments, of sheriff's departments. And what we saw is in some very large suburban, very large counties like Cobb and Gwinnett in Georgia in particular, there was tremendous organizing by immigrants' rights activists over the past few years, and certainly before, that have flipped both of the sheriff's offices in Cobb and Gwinnett to Democratic candidates who were pushed to who were pushed to commit to stop cooperating with ICE, and those two candidates won, and that's going to make a big difference for immigration policy, for immigration enforcement. And I'll just give you one other example. In Oregon, a ballot initiative to decriminalize drug possession won. I have to admit, I didn't expect it to win by the margin it did, but the reason that's important is that it's a national first. It's the first time a state has decriminalized low-level drug possession, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that shapes the national conversation around drug policy and how that shapes the imaginary of other institutions, other states, as to what can be done on these issues. There were actually 4 states that really did just that legalized the recreational use of marijuana. So Arizona, I think, is particularly important to focus on because it had a particularly punitive record policies when it comes to how it treats marijuana policy, and that's going to be very important in Arizona, but also in New Jersey, as you said, and also in South Dakota and Montana. And the last 2 states I mentioned, South Dakota and Montana, are particularly interesting because they also went for President Trump, and by quite a margin. So again, this reinforces the idea that some of these policies are much less controversial than you would think, from the fact that actually either presidential candidate had endorsed the idea of legalizing marijuana this year, neither Joe Biden nor President Trump, even though Joe Biden had some other policies to change approaches to this. In fact, Mississippi also approved an initiative to legalize medical use of marijuana, another win for that movement. And you're absolutely right that what we've seen in the past few years has been a kind of a snowball effect on marijuana policies, and we have seen that on some other issues as well. And that's really going to be key for progressives in the coming years to try and get that type of movement on other issues as well. I mean, there's been a lot of examples of the sort over the past few years. I mean, historically, certainly, the Florida amendment you just mentioned didn't just win; it got more than 60% of the vote. There was actually the threshold; it needed 60%, but that's actually a fairly big gap there between the minimum wage increase at 60% and the share of the vote that Joe Biden got in the same state. But we can think of other policies like that, other than drug policies we were discussing. For instance, I had something in mind that I am. Oh, for instance, I was going to mention the Medicaid expansion, which has really been pushed by Democrats, obviously, over the past decade, and not just blocked by Republicans, but at the moment threatened by Republicans in the U.S. Supreme Court if the ACA falls. Oklahoma and Missouri this summer both approved referendums to expand Medicaid in their state, and obviously both this week went for President Trump by some margin. I don't have a fancy theory of this. This is often discussed. What explains this gap between people's views on some policies and their votes on federal elections, but certainly something that would gain with some more attention. I think we're all trying to figure this out right now. I think two things. First of all, it's bizarre for President Trump to put all of his eggs in the basket of trying to stop ballot counting when he actually currently trails in enough places that would lose him the Electoral College before we even get to Pennsylvania, Georgia, or North Carolina, which have not been called yet. Obviously, having a consistent legal argument has never been a requirement for strategies like this. You can kind of pick and choose what you're trying to do in different places. But in terms of the PR battle he's trying to wage, that is certainly a strange strategy. We certainly are waiting for for the final count in Pennsylvania. It's unclear at the moment whether it will even be close enough to be to really depend on some of the more obvious legal questions that the president's team is trying to spread. So that's like quite a thought number one. The second thought, though, is that it's not because this election wasn't quite potentially. It's not because this election doesn't end up potentially close enough for some of the more outlandish things that the Supreme Court could do or that lawmakers could do to actually end up mattering. That's not a reason to think that that's not actually a problem, right? The U.S. Supreme Court's
right now. Jason, are you there?
Hello. Sorry to cut you off, Dan.
No, of course. Go ahead.
No, so we've left City Hall. Last time I talked to you, we were down at City Hall. Now, we've got a crew of, a conservative estimate would say 800. A less conservative estimate would say 1,000 or so. It was two protests that it's combined. Protesters have been out here since 1 p.m. to argue about a variety of things, whether it was the Trump campaign and Trump siblings, Trump kids coming here to claim that Philadelphia is done and that the ballots have been counted. Pennsylvania is done. It started out with that. Then the civil rights focused protests began, bringing on Free Ant Smith and talking about the Walter Wallace shooting. The city had a press conference in which they were going to talk about the shooting and release the video. That press conference has happened, but the video is not here. We are yet to get the video. Oh, are there any questions? Sorry. Sorry, a drum line just walked by. I think that street protests and mass movement are the only way to prevent a stolen election in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, in my humble opinion. Just because the outpouring of protests and activism in places like Philly has a lot of leadership in these areas terrified of the public, sincerely, and of what activists will do. If they don't count every vote in Philadelphia, everybody's losing their jobs, and it will be non-stop protests. So I think that, yeah. This mask is great. Yeah. The peanut gallery can deal with it. They can hold on to their comments. Never cared, not once. No, but I do think Dan touched on something really important. The people that could swing this state for Trump and actually stop this are in the state Senate and at the judicial level. People like Jake Corman, who have been explicitly obstructionist in the state Senate for months now. It was kind of leading up to this. They already are. They already are. There's multiple lawsuits from the Trump campaign to the Trump lawyers. Eric Trump's tweeting that they already won. The attempts are already happening. Whether they will be successful or not depends on a combination of the will of the people and how pressured progressive leaders in the city are to actually make sure these votes are counted. Because if Pennsylvania doesn't matter, Trump will still care about Pennsylvania for his ego. Winning matters to him. He doesn't want to appear to have lost, even if he loses.
Discussion going. BA, what do you think about the importance of these street demonstrations in ensuring the integrity of the election?
Sure. I hear where Jason is coming from, right? You have to be able to hold the government accountable, and there's a reason that protests, peaceful protests, are legal forms of action by the public. So that makes a lot of sense. And to his point as well, we've seen a lot of ego from this current president, regardless if you're Republican, Democrat, or nonpartisan. Ego is ego at the end of the day, and if he's not going to let it go, that's the people's house at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and they have the right to speak up and make sure that every vote is counted at the end of the day. That's what matters.
All right. Well, thank you to BA, Dan, and Jason. Right now, the last thing I'm going to do is throw it to the viewers. Are there any questions you have about this election that I or any of our esteemed panelists can answer? I know one person asked, who I thought would win, and that is one that I will throw again to Dan and BA and Jason if he's still available. Who do you guys think will win based on the current returns?
I think at this point we know where each candidate is leading. We roughly know what's left. We know that the votes that are left are likelier to go towards Joe Biden. We don't quite know as much. I think the best situation is to pay extreme attention to everything that's going on, especially on the Republican side, to stop the count or change the count. And otherwise, when it comes to the count itself, we should know in the coming hours or coming 24 hours.
Yeah, I mean, it seems safe to say that Biden has won in Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin, which have been called, despite the Trump campaign's attempts to both shut down votes in Michigan and, I guess, somehow try to get votes that have already been cast thrown out, since even if they would have shut down counting now, Biden's still winning in Michigan. I know Lucas had said that he expects Nevada to follow Arizona and likely go for Biden as well. And it seems like Pennsylvania is very much up in the air. It's going to depend on what happens, how many mail-in votes there are for Biden that get counted. But even if Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia go for Trump, which I don't necessarily think is likely, it seems, at least to me, that Biden is competitive, at least in Georgia. If Trump were to just get Nevada at this point, along with Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which have already been called, that would be enough for him to win the election. So I think it's likely, just given where the count is now, that Biden will win. But I am curious, BA, what do you think?
We're going to see the race called for Biden, mainly because he has so many paths, right? It's kind of like this geographic chess game. He has a lot of paths to the White House. Trump really has only had one clear, definite one for the past, let's say, 36 hours. So from a numbers perspective, that makes sense. What I'm really concerned over are these legal and court battles. I'm not so confident in our democracy right now, as I think a lot of Americans are. And that's really nerve-wracking. So I think Biden, he'll cross that 270 mark, but what we see happen after this and the sustainability of our democracy and what Jason was just talking about, the public out there making sure our government officials are held accountable. And thank you to all the journalists and the media that are out there as well, consistently reporting on this and holding every vote accountable. I think we have a lot of gratitude and appreciation to show to them. And that's really going to be the final decider on who our next president is, beyond the numbers.
I do think that there's going to be a major discussion to be had about polling, about who was missed. I do think that the results are many points off from what the final results will be, both in Pennsylvania specifically, but also at the national level. So I think I would just hold off a bit on writing the postmortems on everything before we know actually the results in places like Georgia, places like Pennsylvania, and nationally. And we also are not. You asked what's going to happen. I think we're not talking very much about the rest of the Senate, just to the extent that it's still on the line, that is actually not just undecided based on remaining ballots. It's undecided because of remaining elections, because at least one, if not two, elections will be held in January in Georgia, and the majority of the Senate could possibly be on the line in those elections if they're both on the ballot, and if Democrats were to very difficult feat, no doubt, sweep both of them, it could give them the majority in the Senate still. So it's also important for people to already start thinking, if they care about these issues, about what their plans are for in the lead up to January, what it means for Democrats to potentially try and win other elections. Those are still very much on the table. There's also other runoffs that are going to happen in December. For instance, the New Orleans DA election is going to be very important in December. So there's actually still a lot on the line before we get too much in the analysis of what happened.
Cornyn won his Senate seat back. I think people were, Democrats were very encouraged that Hagar would take that. And it didn't come to fruition last night. There are actually a lot of different House and Senate seats that were, or House seats in particular, about 9 races that they were hoping to claim to either gain majority or at least achieve that 75 even split to have the 150 House seats in Texas. None of that really went according to plan. There wasn't a huge shift as potentially expected. Even Gina Ortiz, a couple years ago, she was up against Will Hurd, who is retiring. She only lost by about 1,000 or so votes. So really everyone thought that was a favorable race, an easy race. We talk about that momentum, the resources put into Texas by DNC, and tables just didn't turn that way. So a lot of eyes on the Senate and the House that it wasn't what everyone necessarily thought or how it was going to turn out. I don't think they can take any sustainability for granted, right? There's always going to kind of be this general voter block that you can rely on per se, but sustainability is a completely different conversation. Even when we go back to the Latino vote, it was not equal. It wasn't equivalent for Biden when you look at Clinton's numbers. And to assume that, even beyond the Latino vote, that a Democrat or Republican can sustain what came before them is a huge mistake. That's very ignorant. So again, going into 2022, 2024, Democrats need to have that good introspection on how to retain, who turned out this year, but also how to build on that momentum going forward and not just rely on resources put into the down ballot and down tickets and community organizers. They really need to make that sincere effort that I spoke about before.
I think a little complicated. I think there are some states where Republicans outperformed compared to expectations. Obviously, Florida, Texas as well. Though it's important to also note that Trump's win is going to be smaller than 4 years ago, but certainly not what was expected, what Democrats hoped in the final days. But then there are states like Arizona and Georgia where Democrats really appear to have broken through at the state level, or at least the local county level, in a way that just wasn't true in the past. And that is the product of a lot of work at the local level, at the state level. And like Arizona, for instance, a very important state that was not really on an easy at all state for Democrats. They hadn't won a U.S. Senate seat there until a couple of years ago, since the 80s. Democrats this year really broke through with a presidential win, apparently a second Senate win. Perhaps they have flipped the state house. It's not fully clear yet. They have won county level elections. Voters have approved higher income tax to fund education. So there's really we're still kind of figuring out the pieces here, and it's early to really have a full story of why Arizona seemed to have swung one way compared to Texas or Nevada, etc. But that's going to be an important story to really qualify the full scope of what happened yesterday.
There's a lot of education, as you pointed out, from Democrats, from media and journalists, voting advocacy orgs, to get people prepared to make a plan, whether it was voting ahead of time or voting on election day. The education about the right, the privilege to vote, and how to do that, that increased substantially this year. I think mostly because of the pandemic, but it's really showed that when people are properly informed, when they are engaged, they will become reliable voters. This also goes back to what we talked about in Harris County. with the issue about the drive-through voting system and why that was under attack by Republicans. The drive-through voting system is so important, especially during a pandemic, because you have so many essential workers, doctors, people who can't, or maybe are probably not willing to put their life on the line just to go cast a ballot. So the accessibility in voting is also a critical component. And that goes even beyond when we look at 2022 and 2024, especially who the Democrats are probably going to be going after with the marginalized communities, people of color. Voter enfranchisement there is very, very low, because at the end of the day, it's not really a right to vote, it's more of a privilege to vote. If you can take off work, if you can get the sitter, if everything lines up accordingly to match your voting plan, then you have the right or that privilege to vote. So many people in this country do not have that privilege as easily as others do. And for Democrats, it probably falls a lot in their voter bloc.
I think it's important for the Democratic candidates to create, obviously, to differentiate them and to really think about exactly what you were saying, the gap between some of the things that voters approve and some of the expectations of how they're voting in federal state elections. I think what is interesting, and that's kind of, I guess, where my work has been in recent years, is that when it comes to county level governments, there's so many low hanging fruits, if that makes sense, to think about in places that are actually already very democratic, and where the elections entirely fought within county boundaries. That's often where we found DAs. That's often where we find prosecutors, county officials, county executives who are not willing to push even some of the policies that federal Democrats are embracing, or that get shy about it, or that don't address the question, or try and not touch, try and act like they're above such issues when they're not. And that's really where a lot of the focus has been over the past few years. Like when we think about how much change there's been through sheriff races in places like Minneapolis or Raleigh that were already Democratic but had very punitive policies, or DA races this year in Austin, again, a very blue area, but it doesn't mean that the change is there towards someone who really embraces the idea of reducing incarceration. Those things really matter, and that's very important to pay attention to in how people think of the space for change. And one question, if Joe Biden were to win the presidency, is how much energy there will still be for people to really care about what's happening at the local level, at the county level, and what their officials are doing if they were to feel more comfortable with what's happening in the federal government, which is not enough. I wouldn't be optimistic about the prospect of any policy that, anyone who's been particularly worked for the Biden presidency would be excited by. With Mitch McConnell, if Mitch McConnell stays at the helm of the U.S. Senate, also has major consequences for courts. Very hard to see Mitch McConnell allow appointments to the courts. He may allow some here and there, but when it comes to appointments that might have the power of shaping the courts, that would be a major issue going forward. There's Justice Breyer is fairly old himself at this point, so that the kind of split government we're talking about would have major consequences for the paralysis of the federal government if it were to happen. We're not sure yet. Thank you for having me.